I'm Brenda Wilson, and I'll be moderating today's panel. We're here to talk about early child development, surviving and thriving, young child nutrition, health, and education. This is being sponsored by the International Center for Journalists and the World Bank's Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. It's part of the initiative Impact Africa, launched earlier this year by Code for Africa and ICFJ, with $500,000 in grants to support data-driven journalism that saves lives. Currently, it's focused on 6 countries in Africa: Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia. These webinars are not lectures. The idea is to support and encourage journalists to report on development issues that don't receive as much coverage as they deserve. If you have questions about Impact Africa, how to apply for it, who's eligible, what sort of financial support is available, we ask you not to bring that up here. Instead, please visit impactafrica.fund/FAQ, FAQ, or email info@impactafrica.fund. To help us explore the issue of early child development, we have with us today experts Leslie Elder, a senior nutritionist with the World Bank, and Emanuela Galasso, an economist with the World Bank's Research Development Group. Leslie Elder has devoted a lifetime, practically, to working on issues related to maternal and child health. She began her career as a pediatric neonatology and obstetrics and gynecology nurse, and has developed an expertise in infant health, adolescent nutrition, with further study at the Johns Hopkins University, and worked with numerous international development organizations before coming to the World Bank in 2009. She has lived in India and Nepal and has experience in dealing with these issues in Latin America and Africa. Emanuela Galasso started out as a young economist at the World Bank in 2000, conducting research on the effectiveness of social protection, essentially the safety net, and anti-poverty programs. She has a PhD in economics from Boston University and is currently investigating the impact of such programs in Madagascar and Chile.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Emanuela Galasso, and I'm here with Leslie Elder. We're very pleased to be here virtually connected with you. And today we're going to talk about the importance of investing in nutrition and early childhood development, why it matters, and what is the evidence of why it matters, and what can we do about it in terms of policy. Shall we start? So today we'll have a brief overview of what healthy early childhood growth and development is. What do we mean by child development, and what are the key aspects that we should be looking at? But more importantly, why should we care? Why does it matter, not only in itself, why we should be interested in investing in children? Why does it matter for development in terms of equity issues, but also efficiency issues? And why does it matter for economic growth of a country? It matters not only for the lifetime of their children and the development of the country within a generation, but it has very important implications for the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We'll do an overview of what is child nutrition, what are the determinants, and why it's critically important to invest in their years. And more broadly, when we think about child development, to the same questions: what are the determinants of child development? Why is the timing of investment important, and what is the critical role of nurture and care? And then we move to a policy aspect in terms of thinking about what are the interventions that have been proven to be effective and work in developing countries with the capacity of within the sort of the capacity of governments, and what should we do to ensure that the children grow well and the investment in people is effective and productive. So when we think about early childhood development, we are thinking about a very holistic and broad concept of child development. We're interested about the physical development, so their nutrition, health, foundations, but more than thinking about survival and height and health issues, we're really interested in a broader concept of child development that encompasses cognitive dimensions, their ability to develop their cognitive ability, and the language skills, which is a very complex aspect to acquire for kids early in their lives. But also, more and more importantly, we're also thinking about their social-emotional well-being. And the social-emotional well-being will have important implications not only for the well-being during childhood, but all these interlinked aspects of child development will have an important bearing on future development. When we think about school performance and the ability to perform in the workforce and the ability to thrive as an adult. So why are the early years important? We're thinking about a tumultuous period of time that starts well before birth. The kids' brain development is very sensitive to input or to invest in very early from a period that starts from in utero and extends with its maximum potential in the first 2 years of life. So this is sort of this increased enormous evidence from the neuroscience literature that the brain has enormous plasticity, and there are sensitive periods where inputs have an enormous potential for brain development. And so the period between the birth and the first 2 years have the highest potential for developing the brain in terms of sensory and language. But then you have a longer time of brain development that does not only stop at year 2, but where language and higher complex mental processes like executive function extend during until young adulthood. And so there is a window of time from neuroscience where the highest plasticity of the brain is such that this is the period where you have the highest potential for making a difference in the child brain, which is important not only for younger ages, but also for later development. But also is the period where there's the highest potential risk of damage. And so if you think about brain development, you can think that sort of the brain starts making connections and creating connections with the very high plasticity and activity in the first 2 years of life. But then after these huge connections in brain development, the brain with experience is shaped by experience. And so if the brain is not properly stimulated and does not get a rich environment, all these connections that are created in these early years start being pruned and cut. And once experience does not support brain development, you can see that after age 6 or 14, then the brain starts specializing in the things where it's been trained and stimulated for. So what are the key factors that promote child development? There is an enormous evidence from neuroscience and child development that shows that the key factors that promote child development are nutrition on one hand, because it sort of feeds the brain. There are some critical inputs that if are not given during this critical time, will not allow the brain to develop and the body to develop. But at the same time, the stimulation of parents sparks their mind, and so this is sort of the enriched environment that allows the brain to develop and the experience to allow the brain to grow and thrive. And so you have these competing sort of risks that come from poverty and adversity. So if you're born from a malnourished mother, your risk of insults to the brain is much higher. If you don't have enough nutrition and key inputs like iodine and iron deficiency, this has sort of an important consequence for brain development, exposure to violence, lack of key nutrients, but also and malnutrition, but also important dimensions like maternal depression or stress during pregnancy and during the early childhood years is recognized as a very important risk factor for brain development. But at the same time, given the high plasticity of the brain, there is lots of evidence that nurture care by mothers, by the caregivers, by preschool teachers can really buffer from the negative effect of all these adversities. And so it's important to recognize that this has very important long-term effects on child development, and these inequities between rich and poor, highly educated and non-highly educated, because of the enormous risk that poor people are exposed to, start emerging very early, well before school starts. So this is research from some work that I'm doing in Madagascar that shows that the gaps between highly educated mothers and uneducated mothers in critical aspects of child development, like sustained attention and vocabulary, start diverging early and then flatten out, and sort of they become early and they become very large well before kids arrive in school. So there is an important question of inequities in child development that reflect all the risks that poor people are exposed to, that emerge early and diverge and during the critical years right before the kids get to school. So by the time where you're ready to invest in schools, their learning potential is much more limited. And so you can think about investing in early childhood development and this competing interaction between risks and protective factors in a lifetime, in a life cycle framework, where early biological risks due to malnutrition and risks that poor people face in utero will take to a lower developmental trajectory. And so the potential that kids will have by being exposed to all these adversities will take them to a lifelong trajectory that does not fully match their potential. But if you have these protected factors in this blue line, then you can reverse some of the negative damage that early risks can cause to the kids. And if you and so you can think about an optimal trajectory where well-nourished kids and well-stimulated kids could attain, and not investing in people, not investing in these early years will not allow kids to reach their developmental potential.
Thanks, Emanuela. So we're going to turn now and dive in a little bit to the whole issue of early child nutrition. So we've heard both from Emanuela about the critical nature of the early foundations for children: nutrition, health, education, freedom from stress, safety. Looking at child nutrition specifically, this fairly complicated framework here, I would focus your attention really at the top two levels. So we have at the top child nutrition. What contributes to that? Well, your most immediate causes of child malnutrition are poor food and nutrient intake or poor health. And there's a very strong connection in a child between being healthy and unhealthy and nutrition. So if a child, for example, has an infection, that child's nutritional needs go up, and yet at the same time, very often, a sick child has much less appetite. So there's weight loss, there are nutrient losses during illness, and then that child has to be fed to recover, and yet at the same time, in a situation of poverty, there are going to be problematic lack of food and nutrition available. So you have at the most immediate level, poor food and nutrient intake and poor health. Then you go down to the next level of underlying causes, and you find that we have three areas to focus on. We have access to food, so food security of a household. We have maternal and child care practices. So does a mother know how to provide the full set of nutrients, food, different kinds of food, and health services to a child? And then finally, the issue of water and sanitation, the environment that a child lives in. So we're going to be looking at these two sets of causes of malnutrition to understand where and why we should be intervening. It's really critical for all of us to understand that all children born have the same growth potential in those first 2 years of life, from the time of conception through 24 months of age. All children have the potential to grow the same, to the same height, at the same brain growth development in healthy environments. And we know this because a study in 2006 looked across 6 countries: Brazil, Ghana, India, Norway, Oman, and the United States. All very different countries, all comprising varying levels of development and poverty. And yet it was found that in each of those country settings, when children received adequate, optimal nutrition and health and stimulation and care, that all children grow approximately the same. After 2 years of age, genetics and other determinants come to play, but that's why we look most particularly at how children grow in those first 2 years. I'm giving you just a few definitions of child growth measurements because we talk very often about stunted children, wasted children, and then the issue of low birth weight. Stunting in particular has become a proxy measure for much of what happens in the early years of a child's life. Stunting means that a child is compared to an international reference population. So compared to children growing well around the world, a stunted child is too short for its age. It has low height for age. And this is an indicator of chronic malnutrition. It also has become the indicator, the measure that the newly announced Sustainable Development Goals will be tracking for countries all over the world. This is going to be the measure, the benchmark that countries are going to look to know whether they have put in place those determinants, those the health, and the stimulation and nurturing for children that we need to see. Wasting means that a child is too thin for its height. And I'll show you a picture in a minute of classically wasted children. We see children wasted usually in situations of distress, of disaster, of famine. This is a kind of undernutrition that happens very quickly. And finally, low birth weight. We look at low birth weight, and this goes back to Emanuela's comments about what happens in utero. we know that actually the growth of a child in utero starts to determine the trajectory of whether or not it will have adequate or inadequate growth in those early years. We know that children born with a birth weight of less than 2,500 grams have either experienced restricted growth in utero due to poor maternal malnutrition, due to maternal infections and other conditions, and or it is a child that was born too early. Both of those things put that child at risk of increased death, early death, of illness, poor growth, and developmental delays. So here's the classic picture that we think of when we think of child malnutrition or undernutrition, and these are wasted children. However, what we see much more of in the world is a stunted child, and yet this is often invisible both to families and to the communities around them, along with micronutrient deficiencies, which are often also invisible. But if we look at these two little girls, the child on the left is 26 months old, so she's just a little bit over 2 years. And then you look at the child on the right, essentially exactly the same height. She is almost 5 years old. She's 4+ years old. So this kind of illustrates very clearly how it's a difficult concept for all of us, for policymakers, for politicians, for health workers, for families, to understand that these two children look quite well, but yet one child has been delayed both in brain growth and in linear growth. The height has all been delayed through a series of negative effects. What are the long-term costs? Emanuela alluded to the fact that we're concerned about issues around poor early childhood development because there are long-term effects. The costs are high. We know that when a child is stunted and understimulated, there is lower child survival. The risk of early death is much, much higher. We know that, for example, currently today, among the deaths in children under 5, nearly half, a little bit over 45%, are attributable to having had poor nutrition, to being stunted. We know that a stunted child has much poorer chances at performance in school, and we know that as adults, their cognition is impaired. We know that there's intergenerational transmission of poverty as well. It's a fact that stunted women, so as mothers are stunted themselves as young children, they grow up, they are stunted adults, their risk of having a stunted child is much increased, and that we need to break this intergenerational transmission of poor growth in order to address later life incidents of poverty. We know also, and this is a fairly recent understanding, that when a child is stunted, both beginning in utero, so that there's poor growth as a fetus, and then in the first 2 years, that child, in the case that it then becomes, that food becomes more available as it grows older, that child has an increased risk of obesity and therefore an increased risk of chronic diseases such as diabetes as it grows older. I just wanted to show you this graph, which really illustrates, again, this idea that there's a window of opportunity. We know from studies across many, many countries that the patterns of child stunting, underweight, and wasting, these are 3 different kinds of undernutrition. As you can see from this graph, children are born already stunted and underweight. So the blue and the green lines are below 0, even at birth. And then you see the downward slope of the blue line, which stops at just about 24 months. And that demonstrates that the process of stunting takes place in those first 2 years and then basically levels out, which then again highlights the point that we need to intervene early. This is a slide that shows the the prevalence of child stunting. So this is in children under 5 around the world between 1990 and 2013. And it's good news. You can see that the lines are all going down. But if you look at the black line, which is the global prevalence, basically is the average across all countries, you see that still in 2013, more than a quarter of the children around the world are stunted. Right now, we estimate that 159 million children are affected. The new Sustainable Development Goals have set a target. It's the World Health Assembly target, which is to reduce the number of stunted children to 100 million by 2025. That still is an awful lot of children who are affected. And we know that the vast majority of stunted children are concentrated in a relatively small number of countries, 37 countries here on this map. And you can see that Africa has many, many of these children. Now, you would think that addressing poverty would be a logical answer, and it is. Child stunting improves, child growth improves with poverty improvement. So as poverty goes down, children grow better. However, it happens at a very slow rate, and we know it's not fast enough to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals that the world has agreed to. Emanuela will talk a little bit more about the impact of underweight and poor child development on the economies of the world. So what can governments do? We know, on the basis of a great deal of research, most recently published in the journal The Lancet, which is a very well-known British journal of medicine, that there are a number of ways that we can intervene that help families to address this issue, particularly of child stunting. They revolve around approaches to improving nutrition for women during pregnancy, for improving infant and young child feeding practices, for example, supporting women to do exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of a child's life. And finally, to improve child nutrition through a number of ways, including, very importantly, micronutrient supplementation. We know, for example, that children need vitamin A, iron, zinc, iodine. All of these are critical to the development of both growth, but also for protecting the immune system and keeping children healthy. So we have a menu of options that governments can take on board with guidance from, for example, the World Health Organization, which sets the standards for implementing these interventions. These are mainly delivered through the health system. I'm going to turn it back over to Emanuela. She's going to talk more about what we can do in addition to addressing malnutrition and child development through the health system.
Yes, as we heard before, nutrition and nurturing the body and the health of the children is one key foundation and important dimension of promoting child development. But nurturing care is as important and can complement the early investment that allow a child to survive and be healthy. So there is a whole range of interventions that can complement the nutrition intervention and can increase the effectiveness of nutrition interventions on the child potential. So also in the Lancet and there's an increase in evidence of interventions that could integrate nutrition and stimulation through home visits, through community-based parenting interventions, through community preschool. So you can focus and complement the early nutrition investments, but also think about a broader set of interventions that are called nutrition sensitive or early stimulation sensitive, that integrate the focus on these first 1,000 days and years into a broader development set of programs. You can think about safety nets and social protection program where cash transfers or short-term interventions really focus on on these early years, and focus on children, pregnant women, and children in the first 2 years. So cash transfer can be interlinked with nutrition interventions, can be interlinked with nutrition and education group activities, so that you can combine economic security with activities that proactively invest in both nutrition and early childhood development. So there is a whole set of programs that can be nutrition sensitive and can promote early stimulation, that can complement nutrition intervention to and promote the child development potential during the early years. And now we as CIF, this Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, we're really investing in building the evidence on interventions that government are piloting, and they are evaluating across sub-Saharan Africa and in other low and middle income countries, where we really want to document what works and why it works. And we are doing this by evaluating these programs rigorously. And one of these examples is the program, a community-based preschool program in Malawi, where informal community preschools have been exposed to investment in high quality training and parenting interventions to promote the child development of the children in Malawi.
As a country, we are trying our best, but we are not yet there. When you go in the centers, they don't have adequate play materials to stimulate the children. And the caregivers, majority of the caregivers are not trained.
The government of Malawi, working with the World Bank, piloted a program to improve the quality of the childcare centers and measure whether the program really helps. To do this, a rigorous impact evaluation was designed. Before the new program began, a baseline survey measured how the childcare centers were performing. Data was gathered on what teachers and caregivers did in the centers, what children were learning, and overall, how well the centers function.
The baselines have revealed that there is quite a lot that is supposed to be done to the children, which is not being done.
The program gave centers materials for teaching children through play and tried different approaches to enhance learning. Community teachers were shown games designed to stimulate child development. Some teachers were paid to see if this motivated them to do better, and parents were taught how to praise and support their children. The impact evaluation will measure the effect of the different approaches on children's development, comparing children who only received play and learning materials with those who received additional support. This way, the evaluation will help Malawi determine the most effective strategy for improving the community childcare centers.
To help us to determine which interventions are likely to give us value for money.
The government will use these results for future decision-making.
When you own the results, because you were part of the process, you know what exactly transpired, because it helps you to be able to interpret the results as they come out. The impact evaluation is one strong piece of evidence that will help us to tell our story.
Hello. I'd like to apologize for that glitch earlier on. It's an instance of, technology doing what technology wants to do, and, what can go wrong will go wrong. But we're back now. And we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. I hope you've been, your curiosity has been stimulated and that you're thinking of questions that you want to submit to the panelists. There is an icon on your screen somewhere which should indicate where you should push forward the Q&A to submit your questions. In the meantime, while you're thinking of questions, I'm going to get you started. I think one of the most exciting things I heard about when I was preparing for this panel was about a study in Jamaica where that was reported on last year, but it was about research that had been conducted almost 20 years ago, in which they provided food and nutritional supplements to children in poor areas who were stunted. And a researcher returned to that the other children received just food and nutrition supplements, and then the doctor who conducted the study also worked with mothers to encourage them to talk to the children, to play with the children, and to provide emotional and psychological stimulation. And there was a control group, as there usually is in the case with these studies. A researcher who returned to Jamaica, now this is like 20 years later after that study was done, to find out what became of the children that participated in that study. And what was kind of really exciting about it was that the children who received, the emotional and psychological stimulation, the benefits produced by that was incredibly substantial. He found sort of tremendous, increased earning power among those that were comparable to children who were not stunted. And, let me pick up my thought. So I'm losing my train of thought. Hold on a second. So it's clear to a certain extent that there are benefits, and most of us probably think that this is all pretty obvious. But I think even researchers and scientists and reporters in developed or Western countries were excited about this finding and wondering whether they provided enough, psychological and emotional stimulation to their own children. My question to the panelists, our experts here, is this all seems so obvious in some ways. It's a good thing to do. It's the humanitarian thing to do, to ensure that children are properly fed and that they receive nutrition. It helps to keep them alive. But at what point did we get to the point where we realize that it's also essential to development, that we included in development as a component of development? How did that idea get started, and where are we now in that?
This is an excellent question, and I think there are different points that made these results very powerful. And the first thing first is the evidence. So by having this study that follow up these children and this intervention in the long term, you can really track what happens to them and what are not only the returns to this investment for their general well-being, but you can measure the returns in terms of actual life and economic terms. So you know what happens to their educational attainment, what happens to their earnings, to their income. And so by putting an economic return to this investment, you can really measure what is the effectiveness of the program, not only from a moral point of view, but also from an economic point of view. And this evidence has been built in the medical and the child development literature for decades, but it's only been in the last 10 years because of this increased evidence from these studies that the economic rationale for doing this investment has also trickled down into economics, and so you can make a moral argument for investing in children, but there's been a confluence in making building the evidence that it also makes sense for investment for the countries, because it's effective and has very high returns for development. And so you have a confluence of a huge evidence from the biological neuroscience and child development literature, but also you have investment that makes sense in economic terms.
But just to add to that, I mean, when you're talking about making a difference in a country and having a conversation with the Ministry of Finance, where policy decisions are made about how a nation's resources are spent, now we have the ammunition to make the case that, as a decision point, to invest in the brain development of children is critical, especially as we enter this digital age across the globe. So that it's a very compelling argument now that we didn't have before when you're sitting down with the Ministry of Finance as opposed to the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Social Welfare. So I think that that's made a huge difference, and it's a critical one. We need to get the attention of policymakers globally about this.
And as a Nobel Prize in Economics, James Harcum had very powerfully documented, this has also it's a win-win solution, because as we saw, these gaps emerge very early between the poor and the less poor groups in society, and the research has shown that by investing in more disadvantaged kids, you have the highest economic returns. And so the return to investing in poor and disadvantaged children, because of this potential for protecting and thriving and reaching their developmental potential, is important not only for an equity point of view, but also for it makes sense economically. The returns to investing in disadvantaged children is very high. And so when you think about difficult decisions that Ministry of Finance have to make, this is and thinking about whether investing, say, in safety nets and redistributing to the poor when they're adults, as opposed to investing in infrastructure, these are decisions that have important trade-offs for where to invest, where it makes more sense. And the evidence has shown that if you invest in children, and in disadvantaged children in particular, this trade-off is not there. You can invest both in redistribution, but also in a way that has very high economic returns. And so James Harcum calls it pre-distribution. You invest early so that the economic cost of helping the poor later on in life is not borne.
All right, questions are beginning to come in. I have a follow-up question to that. I mean, I think we know, how government, we have some sense, let's put it that way, of how government officials respond. You make a good case, but often I think government thinks in terms of short-term impact. They want to see results immediate. And this sounds like the benefits are almost generational. They come down the line. How have governments responded? You make a good case. Have they bought into this? How many governments are buying into, this argument?
Well, more and more governments are becoming aware. So this building the evidence and showing the not only the economic case, but also showing how to do it, how to achieve these objectives. It's how to promote nutrition and early childhood development. There is even if you make the economic case, but you don't know what works and how to make it happen, then governments will even if they're convinced that it's important, might not want to invest it. But on the political economy, it's very important to raise awareness of the huge economic potential for investing in early childhood development. And so broadening the evidence not only on why it matters, but also how to make it happen is critically important for governments to pick up this agenda.
And I just say, Brenda, I think it's important for the journalists to know about a global movement that started in 2010 called Scaling Up Nutrition. Many, many African countries have actually joined this global movement. There are more than 56 countries now. And each of those countries, now, pledging and saying you're going to do something is different than actually delivering. However, 56 countries have signed up and said, we believe that this is a critically important issue. We will place a focal point for our government normally or often in the Prime Minister or President's office to bring together all of the different sectors that impact on nutrition and early child development. So it's worth taking a look at the work that's going on under Scaling Up Nutrition, and that certainly to me is an indication that it has gripped the attention and gotten the attention of governments.
Okay. We do have a question that has been submitted from, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. It's Felicia Phillips. And I apologize if I butchered your name. But she says, many of the exploited territories, and I'm not quite sure to whom or to what country she's referring to, have fertile land. Why is there not more of an effort to provide land security to people? Why not teach the children to possess their land and farm? We also know 24 months of nursing, breastfeeding is optimal for brain and child development. This, I think you've made that point, but I think it's an opportunity to perhaps, bring to mind the fact that these programs are, in various sectors of the government. They're not simply confined to, the Ministry of Women and Health or the Ministries for Children or the Ministries for Welfare, that it can be linked to sort of agricultural programs as well. And if you could address her question, which,
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And one of the things that the World Bank is supporting very, very substantially now is support to, in particular, women smallholder farmers. Because as we know, in the continent of Africa, many, if not the vast majority of farmers, smallholder farmers, are women. So indeed, it makes a great deal of sense to work with these women to help them improve the way that they're doing farming, to help them understand and make available all of the inputs that are necessary for expanding production on their farms. But when you put a nutrition lens on that, when we talk with the Ministry of Agriculture about the issue of improving production, we also suggest to ministries of agriculture that they think about the diversification of what women and smallholder farmers in general are growing. Because we find that, for example, if you focus on cash crops to the exclusion of a diversity of fruits and vegetables, for example, and you don't have knowledge about why a diversity of fruits and vegetables and animal source proteins in a child's diet are important, there is a risk that the farmer may be only growing, for example, rice or maize or a staple crop, and not expanding the range of foods that a child's exposed to in those critical early years. So it's a really good point. We need to work with ministries of agriculture. We do need to support women and all farmers as they work to expand their production, to make sure that their household incomes then are directed towards improving the early years in a child's life.
Okay. I'd also like to, focus in on some of the interventions that have been suggested, because, there are myriad tools available in developed and Western countries. Are the same things required in poorer countries, or can they be more developed? And can they be developed different in different countries, addressing cultural differences, perhaps, or how people view children or a child's place in the family? You talk about, emotional and psychological stimulation, but it can mean very different things in very different places. How does it vary?
This is a critical, important question, and you can't translate and copy examples of successful programs that are very intensive but very costly in low-income settings. So the challenge is to adapt high-quality interventions, curricula, to settings where the capacity of the frontline workers might not be as high, but also the resources devoted to this program might not be as high. And so there is a lot of effort in terms of first understanding what the constraints of mothers are facing. It's what are their time constraints, what are the cultural constraints within the family, what are the messages that resonate to them, what are the emotional hooks in terms of every mother around the world cares about the well-being of their children. They care, they're sort of their loving and affection and their physical contact is there, but they might not be aware that if they're very focused on having them well fed and healthy, they might not be aware of the importance of chanting to them, talking to them, reading a book if it's available. And so there's a whole range of interventions that make this awareness and support, make them aware, but provide also the tools to support their children. Local libraries, community-based interventions where the community worker is present and the support group of the community makes the mother feel that they're supported and they can change things together. So it's important to, in the adaptation, understand the concept, understand what are the challenges that mothers are facing, and adapt intervention to make sure that it's effective in the local context. And this is why the whole effort of adapting, trying, and piloting different interventions that can be put at scale given the development level of these countries is hugely critical to make sure that we can scale up early childhood interventions even in low-income settings.
Okay, I guess the other thing that we perhaps should look at more closely, and that is the mother herself. I mean, you mentioned that if she is constrained by certain things, to what degree have we been effective in getting mothers to seek care before the child is born? And I would assume that, family support, we've talked about the community, but family support and support for the mother and prenatal care, are men buying into it, or if they just leave it to the women to do it?
But it's a really good point. And programs absolutely are trying to focus on the full range of decision makers in the life of a family. So for example, in some cultures, the mothers-in-law are tremendously influential in whether a woman seeks healthcare, whether she eats more or less during pregnancy, whether her workload is reduced, whether there's awareness on the part of the mother-in-law, the husband, and other key decision makers. One project that I worked on many years ago, but I believe that we continue to use this channel, was working with religious leaders in a community. This was in Indonesia, where every young couple needs to seek an appointment with and registration with the local religious official in the community before they marry. And so we worked with those men, they were men, and trained the imams on the issue around iron and folic acid supplementation during pregnancy. We know that a woman who is anemic is at a much higher risk both of death herself during the process of birth, but then also it improves the chances for a child's healthy growth if the mother is not anemic. So we worked with these imams, trained them up, and they were incredibly enthusiastic participants in this health program, giving a very vibrant lecture to each young couple as they came to sign up for a wedding. So it is a really excellent point. We need to work with the full range of influential people in every woman's life.
Yeah, there is another study in Malawi that showed that during these home visits and talking about the importance of nutrition and the early investments that the young family can make, really had an important impact on stunting, mostly as husbands were during these visits became aware of the importance of a diversified diet, the importance of protecting the time of pregnant women, and so the long-term effects on stunting happen through the father increasing their labor supply in the market to provide for this diversified diet and nutrition food. So the involvement and the engagement of fathers and the sort of entire community is critically important. It shouldn't rest only on the women's shoulders. It's a
what about the follow through? I mean, you've talked about how important the first 2 years are, but the children then go off to school. Are teachers prepared? Are the school systems prepared, to work with children to continue this trajectory of helping to develop healthy, smart kids, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's as we've seen, the first 2 years are critically important and lay the foundations, but these investments have to be sustained throughout the lifetime, and especially during the first 5 years, during the time before the kids get to school, but also with later investment in school. So the case we're making is that that the literature is making is that these are the foundations for later life adult outcomes. But yearly investments have to be followed up by later investment at preschools and at the school level. It's just that the early investment make the later investment more productive, and that's the case for investing early. If you start from a stronger base, your investment during preschool or learning in school will be much more productive.
So you're sort of emphasizing, I guess, those first 2 years, the first 1,000 days, primarily. I mean, this is where our
5 years. So the neuroscience shows that first 2 years are very important from a sort of key nutrition perspective, but the brain keeps on developing even beyond the 2 years, and so this protective effect of parents and preschools and school teachers happens throughout the young life of a child. And so this the protective effect and the stimulation that the kids can receive during preschool and during the school year is critically important, especially for the disadvantaged kids who have been more exposed to risk. And so it's critically important to sustain the early investment with during the first 5 years of life to make it the best investment ever, but also throughout the school years.
Are there stories you would like to see? We've seen stories, the Jamaica story got a lot of play. Are there some that you think that have been overlooked, that have been missed, that you wish reporters would spend more time focusing on or investigating or looking into? Where would you direct them to look for some of these stories?
That's an excellent question. To me, I think the importance of this presentation and of the continuing series that the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund is hosting, is supporting, is that once you hear about a story in your country or in your region about the focus, the emphasis on early childhood, that then you would be, as a journalist, sparked to pay attention. I think that's really what I see as one of the most crucial things happening here. For example, all over Africa, you have a range of programs and projects, not necessarily studies, but programs that are being implemented by governments, by international NGOs, all by the World Bank. And so to me, it seems really critical that journalists would be aware and interested in pursuing understanding what a program is doing. So for example, in Mozambique, Save the Children work closely with the World Bank on a combination of early child development, early learning work, and early nutrition. And the joint effort produced some really nice outcomes for the early learning potential for improvement in the lives of these young children in Mozambique. I don't know personally whether there was news stories in Mozambique about that project. We certainly documented it at the World Bank, and Save the Children has documented it well. But those kinds of stories would be incredibly important to broadcast locally, to raise awareness in the Mozambican context of this work and of the importance of it to the community.
Yeah, but picking up the Mozambique example of that work with the community-based preschools, it's really interesting to know what the power of the evidence. By just measuring the delays of kids at the age 3, it was the attention of policymakers was really awakened by the fact that these developmental delays are large, so you can quantify what they are, and they're very sizable, and they start very early, and can have a long-term consequences for learning during elementary school, where the government thinks to start investing in people and human development. And so the power of the data, of the evidence that was brought by measuring these kids with a survey, alerted the awareness of policymakers of the importance of these delays and the potential for correcting this lack of potential for children. So there is an important point in being on building the evidence and making the evidence salient to policymakers and to the wider audience in developing countries through the power of journalism.
And we need to help families raise their demand and awareness. I mean, once you have the information, it's going to be a very powerful tool for individuals and families to, really raise a rallying cry around the need for improved services. So it's both improving the services and increasing the ability to supply, but we need to also increase demand for this kind of attention to young children at country level.
But also the evidence is super important in documenting how to do it. Mm-hmm. So everybody can be aware of the importance of investing in early childhood development, but how do you do it in a low-income environment with lots of competing demands with very limited funds? You have to make hard choices. And so if you can document ways of delivering these services in a way that it's cost-effective and feasible, and that resonates to the local context, that's sort of the best service you can do to human development and the development of these countries.
Okay, since this is sort of being brought in part by the World Bank's Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, is there an instance where there has been an evaluation or the results of an evaluation had an impact on the way, child programs or something in a country was done, or, where funding changed as a consequence?
Yeah, Mozambique. So Mozambique was a pilot where was done by through an NGO, Save the Children. But then it was picked up by the government as an important investment to make, and so CIF now is working with the government. With the researchers are working with the government of Mozambique on its scale-up project. How do you take this small example, working with an NGO, and make it effective at scale through the health system, through the preschool education system in the country, and make it effective? And what are the key parameters that make this delivery work in a system at scale? So another, I think, powerful example is that I worked on is on Madagascar on a nutrition program where the government is really committed in investing in nutrition, and there was a long-term evaluation that showed important results on moderate malnutrition, but stunting, which was not salient in their as a key objective, was not effective. And so by providing the evidence, the government worked with the research team and the World Bank to go back to the drawing board. Is the program as designed reaching the key outcomes that we're interested in, or should the scope be expanded? Should we invest integrating nutrition and early childhood development? Is the program intensive enough? And what are the key dimensions in service delivery that make this program most effective? And I think sort of the science of implementation and the evidence of what works is critical to help this government achieve this potential.
Is there ongoing research that you would recommend that reporters look into? Perhaps the results are not yet in, but it shows exciting potential, or, you know?
We're working on it. So it's finally getting the first wave of results of investment across the board, be it on nutrition and nutrition integrated with the social protection on agriculture, early childhood development, informal or through formal preschools, and different modes of service delivery through the government, through NGOs, with different intensity or quality. And so, but stay tuned. We have a communication department that is working exactly on trying to disseminate this evidence. But we are not the only one. There is a huge movement to build in this evidence, and sort of we have a website that we'll share after the webinar, where all these results that are coming out will be documented and disseminated and to the wider audience, both academic policy and sort of to a general audience.
Okay. If either of you have parting thoughts before I wrap this up, we don't have any further questions from the journalists, but if you have parting thoughts that you would like to offer.
Wisdom.
Yeah. No, simply just to really re-emphasize the point, and I think we've made it over and over, that we see journalists as a critically important partner in getting the word out about the nature of why and how this particular aspect of human development can be addressed, why it's so important, and why we hope we can partner with countries in Africa, and particularly with journalists, to get the word out. So I think you're going to cover some of the high points of our bottom line messages, Brenda, but just to say, do keep an eye out and check back with the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund results as they come out, because these in particular are going to help all of us to understand how to be most effective in building this foundation that we think is so important for the world.
All right, then. I'd say there are about 5 major takeaways from the presentation that I heard today. And one of them, the main one, of course, is that the building blocks for a successful and productive life are needed in those first 1,000 days. You know, when a child's brain and its body is beginning to grow, even before the child begins to speak. In the early years of a child's life, it may be difficult to determine just by looking at them, you know, whether their growth has been stunted. A child may look okay and still not be receiving all the nutrients and attention they need to grow and be healthy. So it's important to pay attention and make sure that they get, you know, the nutrition and attention that they need. The second point I guess I would raise would be children who get the right start in life, starting with good nutrition and health, plus stimulation, will become healthier and more productive adults and be prepared for raising their own healthy children. The most essential consideration of the health of the child is family support. And that includes not just mothers, but fathers too. And delays, if these things are not done, it's really important to know, delays in a child's growth and development are hard to reverse. You know, so you want to make sure they get a good start. And evidence shows that young children who receive the appropriate nutrition, healthcare, and emotional and cognitive stimulation are better prepared for the next stage in life when they head off to school and learn. It's going to be much easier for them if they've gotten a good start in those first 2 years. And last but not least, you know, for heads of government that we want to sort of communicate to, you know, our report is to communicate to the public. Healthy children become healthy parents, which leads in turn to the health of nations. So I see that I'm going to just double check here. I think there may be one, okay, someone has a message they want to communicate. It's Felicia again. She says, diversification in the food supply could be met with a collective community effort. I believe each of you addressed that. Teach communities to farm, protect, and nurture women. So it's important to nurture women. So I think she wanted to just make that point. If you'd like to add something to that, okay. Again, if you're interested in finding out about support and reporting on early childhood development issues and impact evaluation, please visit impactAFRICA.fund/FAQ or email info@impactAFRICA.fund. You will find more information on the application, eligibility, and more. Thank you for joining us. I hope this helps, and I'll be looking for your story. And I hope you're out there digging, looking around, and finding out, because children are important. Thank you.
Thank you very much.